It all started with a truck. Not a shiny brand new one, but an old, reliable pickup that had been in the family for years. Its paint had faded from a deep forest green to a dull olive shade, with a few scratches and dents along the sides from years of hard work. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect, but it ran, it hauled, and it was paid off. For Mark, the truck was more than just transportation. It was a piece of history. He had used it to move into his first apartment. He had driven it across the state to bring furniture to his parents when they retired. It had carried wood, soil, tools, and everything else he needed for weekend projects. It was a symbol of independence, resilience, and utility. But for one person in the neighborhood, it was nothing more than an eyesore. That person was Karen. Karen was not officially in charge of the HOA, but she acted as though she ran the entire community. Was the type who patrolled the streets with a clipboard, peeking over fences and snapping photos of anything she believed violated the rules. In her mind, she was the enforcer of suburban order, a self-appointed guardian of property values. When she first noticed Mark's truck parked in his driveway, she saw it not as a tool or a family memory, but as a blemish on the neighborhood. To her, its faded paint and rugged condition lowered the overall prestige of the community. She had complained about lawn heights, mailbox colors, and even Christmas decorations in the past. But now, she had a new target: Mark's truck. At first, the complaints came in the form of polite notices. Generic slips of paper tucked under the windshield wipers that read, "Your vehicle does not meet HOA standards." Mark ignored them. He knew his truck wasn't against any official rule. There was nothing in the HOA handbook that dictated the age or appearance of vehicles. Only that they had to be operable and legally registered. His was both, but Karen wasn't satisfied with being ignored. Soon, she escalated. The notices became more aggressive. Instead of paper slips, she filed formal complaints with the HOA board. She argued that the truck was too ugly and detrimental to property values. She insisted that something had to be done before. In her words, the neighborhood started looking like a junkyard. The board, however, was hesitant. They knew Karen had a reputation for exaggeration. She had made noise complaints about children playing outside, and even tried to stop a neighbor from building a small shed in their backyard. Still, Karen was relentless. She attended every meeting, brought printed photographs of the truck, and spoke about it as though it were a criminal act. For Mark, the harassment didn't stop at meetings. Karen made it personal. She stood in her yard whenever he came home, shaking her head in disapproval, made snide remarks within earshot, calling the truck a rust bucket or that heap. And more than once he noticed her walking around his property, phone in hand, taking pictures without his permission. At first, Mark tried to brush it off. He wasn't the type to seek conflict. He believed that if he followed the actual rules, he didn't need to justify himself to a nosy neighbor. But the constant pressure began to wear him down. Started worrying about fines, about potential harassment letters, about the possibility that the HOA board might eventually give in to Karen's demands just to quiet her down. The breaking point came one morning when Mark found a bright orange sticker on his windshield. It looked official, almost like a city notice, with bold letters that read "Violation." It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from law enforcement. It was homemade, laminated, and designed to look threatening, but clearly crafted by someone with a printer and too much time on their hands. That someone was Karen. It was then that Mark realized this wasn't just about a truck. It was about control. Karen wasn't satisfied until she had the final say in how everyone lived. And if she could make an example out of him, she'd feel even more powerful. But what Karen didn't know was that Mark wasn't as powerless as she thought. He had kept quiet, respectful, and calm. But he was observant. He noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that Karen's own backyard had an unpermitted structure, a shed larger than what the HOA allowed. He noticed that her fence was 2 feet taller than regulation. He noticed the constant flow of contractors, landscapers, and deliveries, many of which violated HOA rules about work hours. Karen had built her reputation on pointing out the flaws of others, but she had overlooked her own. And Mark, for the first time, began to wonder what would happen if the spotlight turned on her as he stood in his driveway. Holding the fake violation sticker in his hand, a plan began to form. This wasn't going to be about retaliation for the sake of revenge. It was going to be about exposing hypocrisy, about showing the neighborhood who Karen really was. And so, while Karen prepared for her next attack, Mark quietly began gathering evidence of his own. He documented her violations. He checked the HOA guidelines carefully, making sure he understood the exact rules she had broken. Took photos, kept records, and built a case slowly and carefully, just as she had done against him. But unlike Karen, Mark had patience. He wasn't going to storm into a meeting and demand action. He was going to wait until the timing was perfect. Until Karen was so sure of her power that the reveal would leave her no room to escape. The neighborhood had seen Karen as the self-proclaimed enforcer for far too long. Soon they would see her as something else entirely. And with every photo he snapped, with every note he wrote, Mark knew one thing for certain. Karen had started a war she couldn't win. Karen wasn't used to being ignored. In her mind, authority was meant to be respected. And when she issued an order, even if it wasn't an official one, she expected compliance. For weeks, she had tried to shame Mark into moving or hiding his old pickup truck. She left notes, made complaints, and even resorted to her fake violation sticker. None of it worked. But instead of backing down, she escalated. She began appearing at HOA board meetings more frequently, speaking louder, staying longer, and painting an increasingly dramatic picture of how the truck was supposedly destroying the neighborhood's reputation. She claimed that potential buyers would be driven away, that the presence of such a vehicle would lead to falling home values, even suggested that it might attract undesirable types. Each time she spoke, she framed herself as the lone warrior standing up for the standards of the community. The board, spade up of neighbors who volunteered their time, didn't know how to handle her persistence. They had heard her rants before about things as minor as lawn ornaments and seasonal decorations. But Karen had a way of wearing people down. She came prepared with photos, dates, and exaggerated statistics she claimed to have researched online. It didn't matter if her facts were flimsy, what mattered was her persistence. And slowly, her persistence began to shift the tone of the board. Mark wasn't oblivious to this. He knew that while his truck technically broke no rule, the board might eventually buckle under the weight of Karen's complaints. All it would take was one motion, one majority vote, and they could create a new regulation targeting vehicles like his. It wouldn't be fair, but fairness had never been Karen's priority. Control was. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign extended beyond board meetings. She started whispering to neighbors during her morning walks, spreading gossip about Mark and his truck. She suggested that he didn't take care of his property, that he was dragging the whole community down, and that he might even be violating city codes. For those who barely knew Mark, her words planted seeds of doubt. For those who knew him better, they rolled their eyes but said little. Afraid of becoming Karen's next target, the pressure built like storm clouds over the neighborhood. Each day, Mark felt the eyes of neighbors lingering just a little longer. On his driveway, some avoided eye contact. Others offered sympathetic glances, but stayed silent. They didn't blame them. Karen's reputation for hostility was well known. Few wanted to get caught in her crosshairs. One afternoon, Mark came home to find a certified letter waiting in his mailbox. His heart sank as he recognized the HOA's return address. He opened it slowly, scanning the page. It was a notice of concern, formally written and citing multiple complaints regarding the condition and visibility of a vehicle. It wasn't a violation, but it was a warning. The kind of warning that could lead to fines if the matter wasn't resolved. Karen had finally gotten what she wanted. The board was now officially involved. For a moment, Mark felt the weight of defeat. He considered the possibility of hiding the truck in his garage or parking it elsewhere just to avoid the hassle. But then he reminded himself of something critical. He had done nothing wrong. His truck was operable, registered, and within the rules. He wasn't the problem, Karen was. And that's when his quiet campaign of gathering evidence became more serious. While Karen was busy trying to sway the board, Mark began piecing together her violations with meticulous care. He already had photos of her oversized shed, a structure that clearly exceeded HOA limits without any approved variance. He had images of her towering fence, 2 feet higher than regulations allowed. He had documented the frequent contractor vehicles parked overnight in front of her home, direct breach of neighborhood parking rules. But Mark wasn't just taking pictures. He was building a timeline. He noted dates, times, and even cross-referenced. Then with the HOA handbook, where Karen relied on bluster and exaggeration, Mark relied on precision and patience. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Karen was the biggest violator in the entire neighborhood. Her constant campaigning wasn't about protecting property values. It was about deflecting attention away from her own rule-breaking. Mark didn't share his findings immediately. He knew timing was everything. If he moved too soon, Karen might find a way to spin the story in her favor. But if he waited until she had pushed too far, till she was at the peak of her arrogance, then the impact of his reveal would be devastating. And that opportunity came sooner than he expected. Karen, emboldened by the board's warning letter, to Mark, decided to make her campaign public. She printed flyers and slipped them into mailboxes, calling for a neighborhood standard initiative. On the flyers, she included a photo of Mark's truck parked in his driveway, circled in red, as though it were evidence of a crime. She urged residents to sign a petition demanding stricter vehicle appearance rules, specifically targeting unsightly, aged, or neglected automobiles. When Mark pulled one of the flyers from his own mailbox, he felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was public humiliation. Karen had crossed a line. She had done so in a way that made her look unstoppable. But what Karen didn't realize was that by going public, she had given Mark the perfect opening. Now her campaign wasn't just about him, it was about the entire neighborhood. And if he revealed her violations in response, the whole community would see her hypocrisy in full, as Mark sat at his desk that evening. Organizing his notes and photos into a neat binder, he felt the first flicker of confidence he'd had in weeks. Karen thought she had cornered him. She thought she had stripped him of options. But in truth, she had just built the stage for her own downfall. The war over the truck was no longer just about an old vehicle. It was about exposing the truth. And when the truth came out, Karen wouldn't just regret targeting Mark, she'd regret ever pretending to be the enforcer of rules she herself had broken. The board's next meeting was approaching. Karen was preparing to make her boldest move yet. What she didn't know was that Mark was preparing too. Only his move would be the one nobody saw coming. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt charged. Word had spread quickly about Karen's petition. Some residents supported her call for stricter vehicle standards, though many did so reluctantly, simply to avoid her wrath. Others grumbled in private, frustrated with her constant meddling but unwilling to confront her publicly. For most, the meeting promised drama, and they intended to be there for the spectacle. Mark walked into the community center with his binder tucked under his arm, kept his face neutral, calm, giving nothing away. He knew Karen would be waiting, with her usual theatrics, and the last thing he wanted was to show nerves. His preparation had been meticulous, his evidence airtight. All he had to do now was wait for Karen to hang herself with her own words. The board members sat at the front of the room, their expressions weary. They had endured Karen's tirades before, but tonight was different. Tonight she was armed with signatures, photographs, and the momentum of her latest crusade. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time. She stood up, cleared her throat dramatically, and launched into her performance. She spoke about pride in the community, about protecting property values, about maintaining a standard of excellence. She waved her petition in the air, boasting about the number of neighbors who had signed. She held up enlarged photos of Mark's truck, mounted on foam board, as though they were evidence in a trial. Each time she spoke, she turned toward the audience, gesturing with exaggerated passion. Her words were sharp, laced with a kind of self-righteous certainty that left little room for rebuttal. According to Karen, Mark's truck was not just a vehicle, it was a symbol of decline, a warning sign that the neighborhood was slipping into disrepair. And she positioned herself as the hero, the one person brave enough to speak up. Some neighbors nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable. The board members shifted in their seats, clearly eager to move past the ordeal, but too cautious to silence. For nearly 20 minutes, Karen dominated the floor, building her case and basking in the attention. When she finally finished, the room erupted in a mix of polite applause and awkward silence. Karen sat down with a smug smile, convinced she had one. She glanced at Mark across the room, her eyes glittering with triumph. That was the moment Mark had been waiting for. When the board asked if anyone else wished to speak, Mark rose slowly, carrying his binder. He didn't raise his voice or wave his arms. He simply walked to the front, set the binder on the table, and opened it. The room quieted, curious. Mark began by addressing the petition directly. He pointed out that while Karen had gathered signatures, the HOA handbook contained no rule against vehicles like his. His truck was operable, legally registered, and parked within the guidelines. The petition, he explained, sought to create new rules, retroactively rules that targeted a single homeowner rather than serving the community fairly. He paused, letting that sink in. The board members nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of his statement. Then, with measured calm, Mark turned the conversation toward Karen herself. He explained that while she had accused him of neglecting standards, he had noticed several areas where her own property did not comply with the HOA handbook. He flipped open his binder, revealing photographs, clear, time-stamped. The first set showed her backyard shed, significantly larger than the maximum size allowed. The second set revealed her fence, towering above regulation height. The third documented contractor vehicles parked overnight, some blocking sidewalks, all in violation of HOA rules. The room stirred with whispers. Karen's confident expression faltered as neighbors leaned forward to see the evidence. Mark didn't stop there. He methodically listed each violation, citing the exact page and section of the handbook. Unlike Karen's emotional appeals, his presentation was factual, precise, and undeniable. The board members exchanged looks. Their hesitation, once palpable under Karen's barrage, shifted into concern. For years they had endured her complaints, but now it was clear she had been breaking the very rules she weaponized against others. Karen tried to interrupt, insisting that Mark was twisting the facts, but her protests rang hollow. Each time she objected, Mark calmly referred back to the handbook and his documented proof. The contrast between her frantic defensiveness and his steady composure was striking. By the time Mark closed his binder, the dynamic of the room had completely changed. The neighbors who had once avoided his gaze were now looking at him with quiet admiration. Those who had signed Karen's petition out of fear began whispering among themselves, embarrassed to have been manipulated. The board, visibly tired of Karen's antics, announced that they would review Mark's evidence and address the violations accordingly. For the first time, Karen's authority crumbled. She sat stiffly in her chair, face flushed, clutching her petition as though it could shield her from the reality settling over the room. The meeting ended not with her triumphant demands, but with the board openly acknowledging her infractions. As people filed out of the community center, the whispers grew louder. Karen had spent years painting herself as the neighborhood's moral compass, the defender of standards. But now, her hypocrisy was laid bare, and Mark, the man she had tried to humiliate, had become the quiet voice of reason who exposed her. The victory felt sweet, but Mark knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She would push back, deny, and attempt to shift blame. He had struck a blow, but the war wasn't finished. Back at his house, Mark parked his truck in the driveway as usual. The first time in weeks, he felt no shame, no worry about judgmental stares. Instead, he felt a calm satisfaction. Karen had wanted a battle, and now she had won, but it wasn't going the way she had planned. What Karen didn't realize was that the damage was already spreading. Her petition, once a symbol of her control, had become evidence of her obsession. Neighbors who had once tolerated her now saw her differently. The mask had slipped, and behind it was not a guardian of the community, but a hypocrite grasping for control. The board's decision in the coming weeks would seal her fate. And Mark, binder in hand, was ready for whatever came next. Karen had never experienced public humiliation like the one at the HOA meeting. For years, she had built herself up as the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian, the woman who kept everyone else in line. She had stood at the podium countless times, issuing complaints and threats, and people had listened, if not out of respect, then out of fear. But now, her authority had been shattered in front of everyone, when Mark exposed her violations with undeniable proof. It wasn't just a personal defeat. It was a collapse of her carefully constructed persona. Neighbors who once avoided her now whispered behind her back. Some stopped waving when she walked by. Others smirked knowingly, as if silently celebrating her downfall. The power she once held through intimidation was slipping away like sand between her fingers. But Karen was not the type to accept defeat. Instead of retreating quietly, she doubled down. Within days of the meeting, she was back on the warpath. She couldn't destroy Mark through the HOA. She would find other ways. And so began a new wave of retaliation, petty, vindictive, and relentless. It started with noise complaints. Karen filed reports with the city, claiming Mark's truck was too loud when he started it in the mornings. She exaggerated, describing it as deafening and a public nuisance. Inspectors came, listened, and quickly determined it was no louder than any other pickup. But Karen didn't care about the outcome. She cared about making Mark's life difficult. Next came accusations of illegal parking. She took photos of his truck from multiple angles, sending them to the HOA and claiming it extended beyond his driveway onto the sidewalk. The board, weary of her antics, dismissed the claims after measuring the space themselves. Still, Karen persisted, bombarding them with new photos week after week. When those tactics failed, she escalated further. She reported Mark to animal control, insisting his dog barked excessively and disturbed the peace. The officer who came out found the dog calm and friendly, lying quietly on the porch. It was clear the complaint was baseless, but the message— it was obvious Karen was willing to weaponize any system, any authority to harass him. Mark noticed the pattern but refused to be baited. Each time an official appeared at his door, he greeted them politely, provided whatever proof they needed, and watched as they left satisfied. He knew Karen's desperation was her undoing. The more she attacked, the more obvious her obsession became. But Karen wasn't finished. Late one evening, Mark noticed movement outside his house. When he looked out the window, he saw Karen standing near his driveway, phone in hand, snapping photos of his truck. It wasn't unusual for her to take pictures, but this time, she lingered. She crouched, angled her phone beneath the bumper, even leaned across his property line to get closer. Mark documented her behavior, filming quietly from inside his house. He didn't confront her. He didn't need to. He understood that evidence was more powerful than anger. By the time she scurried back to her home, he had several minutes of footage showing her trespassing. The next day, Mark added the footage to his binder. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building a case so strong it could end Karen's reign of harassment permanently. Meanwhile, Karen's reputation spiraled further downward. The neighbors she once manipulated began to distance themselves. Some openly avoided her, crossing the street when she approached. Others muttered under their breath when she launched into her rants. Her petition, once a sign of power, now symbolized her obsession. People began to see Mark not as the problem, but as the victim of her relentless bullying. And yet, Karen couldn't see it. In her mind, she was still fighting the good fight, still protecting the neighborhood from decline. She convinced herself that Mark had manipulated the board, that his evidence was fabricated, that she was the only one brave enough to stand against him. The more the community turned on her, the more entrenched she became in her own narrative. Her breaking point came 2 weeks later at the next HOA board meeting. Determined to reclaim her authority, she stormed in with another stack of photos and complaints. This time, she accused Mark of running an illegal business out of his home, claiming his truck was used for commercial purposes. She argued that he was operating without a permit, violating zoning laws, and endangering the community. But the board had grown tired of her. They listened politely, then asked for evidence. Karen waved her photos, but they showed nothing more than a truck parked in a driveway. When pressed, she grew flustered, unable to provide proof. Finally, one board member reminded her of the outstanding violations on her own property. Oversized shed, the illegal fence, the contractor vehicles. The room fell silent. Karen's face burned red as she realized she had walked directly into a trap of her own making. Instead of regaining control, she had highlighted her hypocrisy once again. The board announced that her violations would be formally reviewed with potential fines to follow. For Mark, it was another quiet victory. He hadn't needed to say a word. Karen's desperation had spoken for itself. But as he left the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wouldn't stop. Karen wasn't rational. She wasn't capable of accepting accountability, and that made her dangerous. Sure enough, the next morning, Mark discovered fresh retaliation. His mailbox had been stuffed with anonymous flyers copies of the same petition. Karen had circulated weeks before, only now with angry scribbles in the margins, accusing him of being a rule breaker and a threat to the community. The handwriting was shaky, the words underlined aggressively. Everyone knew who was behind it. Instead of feeling threatened, Mark felt a strange sense of clarity. Karen's campaign was unraveling in real time. Her desperation was making her sloppy, her lies more transparent. And with every move she made, he gained more leverage. The war Karen had started over a pickup truck was turning into her own undoing. What had begun as harassment had evolved into a full-scale collapse of her credibility. And Mark, patient and steady, was there to document every step. As he looked out at his old truck sitting peacefully in the driveway, Mark realized the vehicle had become more than just a symbol of utility or memory. It had become the catalyst for exposing the truth about Karen, and soon, the entire neighborhood would see just how far she was willing to go, and just how far she would fall. By the time the next month rolled around, Karen's obsession with Mark and his old pickup truck had reached a dangerous new level. The board's growing disapproval hadn't deterred her. The whispers from neighbors hadn't humbled her. Every setback only seemed to fuel her determination, twisting her perspective further. In her mind, she wasn't the villain everyone else saw. She was the lone defender of a neighborhood under siege, but obsession has a way of blinding people. And Karen's blindness was about to push her over the edge. It began with small acts of vandalism. One morning, Mark found deep scratches along the side of his truck, running jaggedly from the front fender to the door. The marks were too deliberate to be accidental. He took photos immediately, adding them to his growing collection of evidence. A week later, his trash cans were mysteriously knocked over, garbage strewn across the lawn. Again, he documented everything. Neighbors began to notice the pattern. Some even whispered to him quietly, admitting they had seen Karen lurking around his property late at night. Others confessed that she had tried to recruit them into filing complaints against him, offering promises that if they supported her, she would go easy on them in the future. It was clear Karen's tactics were becoming more desperate, more reckless. But the tipping point came one evening when Mark returned home from work. He pulled into his driveway and immediately saw that his truck's tires had been slashed, all 4 of them deflated and useless. The cuts were clean, deliberate, and malicious. Mark stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling over him. This was no longer about HOA politics or harassment. This was criminal. And it was the moment Karen officially crossed the line. He called the police. Filing a report and providing the officers with the video footage he had captured weeks earlier of Karen trespassing on his property, he handed over the photos of the scratches, the notes of her bizarre behavior, and the testimonies from neighbors who had seen her prowling late at night. The officers listened carefully, nodding as they pieced together the pattern. Karen, of course, denied everything when questioned. She laughed off the accusations, calling them ridiculous and fabricated. She insisted she was being targeted unfairly, that Mark was manipulating the situation to make her look bad. But the evidence was too strong and her denial too weak. The officers issued a stern warning, explaining that if she was caught again, she could face charges for vandalism and harassment. For most people, such a warning might have been enough to stop, but not for Karen. To her, the police involvement wasn't a sign to back down, it was proof that Mark was conspiring against her. Her paranoia deepened, feeding her obsession. She became more unpredictable than ever. Meanwhile, Mark realized the time had come to act decisively. For months, he had endured Karen's harassment, quietly gathering evidence while she dug herself deeper into a hole. Now, with the police involved, and the neighborhood watching closely, he had the perfect opportunity to reveal everything. He compiled his binder into a presentation, organized, thorough, impossible to dismiss. He included the photos of Karen's shed-in fence, the documented contractor violations, the trespassing footage, the vandalism, slashed tires, even screenshots of the flyers she had distributed. He also included statements from neighbors who had grown tired of her bullying, many of whom were finally willing to speak up after seeing how far she had gone. The next HOA meeting promised to be the most important yet. Word spread quickly, and attendance was higher than ever. Residents who had previously avoided the drama now came out of curiosity, eager to see what would unfold. Everyone knew the tension between Karen and Mark had reached a breaking point, and they wanted front row seats to the outcome. Karen arrived at the meeting armed with yet another stack of complaints, convinced she could still sway the board. She strutted in, as though nothing had changed, though the whispers that followed her betrayed the shift in the neighborhood's perception. When the meeting began, Karen launched into her usual speech, railing against Mark's truck and painting, herself as the victim of harassment. She accused Mark of orchestrating a smear campaign, of turning the community against her with lies. She claimed the vandalism to his truck was a stunt he had staged himself to gain sympathy. Her voice grew shrill as she waved her arms, desperate to regain the authority she once held. And then Mark stood. He didn't need theatrics. He simply opened his binder and began to present. One by one, he laid out the evidence. Photos of her violations, records of her repeated complaints, video of her trespassing, reports of vandalism, police involvement, neighbor testimonies. Every piece of the puzzle fit together, painting a clear and damning picture of Karen's behavior. The room was silent as Mark spoke. The board members leaned forward, their faces grave. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief as they saw just how deep Karen's hypocrisy ran. The longer the presentation went on, the smaller Karen seemed to shrink in her chair. By the time Mark finished, there was no doubt left. Karen wasn't a protector of the neighborhood, she was its biggest problem. The board responded swiftly. They announced that Karen's violations would be fined, her shed and fence required to be brought into compliance. They also issued a formal motion to censure her, barring her from filing further complaints until her own property was corrected. The room erupted in quiet applause, neighbors relieved to see justice finally catching up with her. Karen tried to protest, her voice shaking, but nobody listened. Her power had evaporated. The very community she claimed to represent now saw her for what she truly was: a bully, a hypocrite, and a menace. Mark sat back down, calm and composed. He hadn't needed anger or retaliation, just patience and truth. The old pickup truck still sat in his driveway unchanged, yet it had become the catalyst for a transformation in the neighborhood. Karen had crossed the line, and in doing so, she had destroyed herself. But even as the meeting ended and neighbors congratulated Mark quietly, couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wouldn't disappear so easily. People like her rarely did. She had been humiliated, fined, and stripped of her authority, but obsession is a powerful thing, and Mark knew, deep down, that she might still have one last desperate move left in her. The fallout from the last HOA meeting spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. For years, Karen had positioned herself as the voice of authority, but now she had been publicly exposed, fined, and stripped of credibility. The smug confidence she once carried had evaporated, replaced with a thin mask of defiance that fooled no one. Neighbors avoided her more openly now. Some even laughed quietly when they saw her pacing her yard with her clipboard, as if she could still pretend she was in charge. But humiliation has a strange way of fueling the desperate. Instead of retreating, Karen stewed in silence. Each day that passed, her bitterness grew. The sight of Mark's truck in his driveway became unbearable to her. It wasn't just about the vehicle anymore. It was about the fact that he had beaten her, exposed her, and shattered her control. She convinced herself that she hadn't lost. Not really. In her mind, the board was weak. The neighbors were gullible. And Mark had orchestrated everything through lies and manipulation. She saw herself as the victim of a conspiracy. Once someone believes they are the victim of a grand plot, they become dangerous. So Karen began planning. Unlike her past outbursts, this time she moved quietly. She stopped filing daily complaints. She stopped storming into board meetings. She stopped leaving notes and flyers. On the surface, it almost looked like she had accepted defeat. But Mark wasn't fooled. He knew Karen too well by now. Silence from her wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm, and the storm arrived one. Thursday morning, Mark awoke to find a letter taped to his front door. It wasn't from the HOA or the city. It was a formal-looking envelope stamped with a law office's insignia. Inside, he found a notice of intent. Karen had hired a lawyer and was threatening to sue him for defamation, harassment, and emotional distress. The letter claimed that Mark's campaign of lies had damaged her reputation, caused her financial hardship, and led to significant emotional suffering. It was absurd. Every piece of evidence Mark had presented was true, backed up by photos, dates, and even police reports. But Karen didn't care about truth. She cared about control. And now, she was using the legal system as her last weapon. Mark sat quietly reading the letter twice. A flicker of unease crept in. Lawsuits were messy, expensive, and time-consuming. Even if Karen had no real case, she could drag him through months of headaches. That, he realized, was her goal. It didn't need to win, she just needed to punish him for daring to stand up to her. But Mark wasn't unprepared. For months he had been documenting everything. Not just for the HOA, but in case Karen ever pulled something like this. He had timestamps, video footage, neighbor statements, and police involvement. He had enough. Evidence to prove that she had been the aggressor from the very beginning. He knew, deep down, that if this reached a courtroom, Karen would embarrass herself even more. Still, the lawsuit marked a new phase in their war. No longer confined to the neighborhood or the HOA, their conflict was now spilling into legal territory. And the neighborhood noticed. Whispers of Karen's lawsuit spread quickly. Some neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, others laughed openly, but a few grew concerned. They worried that if Karen succeeded even in a small wit, could set a precedent. What if every petty dispute in the community turned into a courtroom battle? The thought unsettled them. Mark, however, stayed calm. He knew panic would only give Karen what she wanted. Instead, he began preparing once again, expanding his binder into a full case file. He contacted a lawyer of his own, someone experienced in dealing with frivolous lawsuits and harassment claims. Together, they pieced through every detail, every photo, every complaint. They built a defense so strong, it bordered on offense. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood as if she had already won. She told anyone who would listen that Mark would regret ever crossing her. She hinted that she would take his truck, his property, maybe even his home when she won the case. For a brief moment, her confidence returned. But to the neighbors, it rang hollow. They had seen her fall before, and they weren't convinced she could climb back up. The next HOA meeting only deepened the tension. Karen arrived late, her head high, carrying a folder marked legal documents. She interrupted the agenda to announce publicly that she had initiated legal action against Mark. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed through, framing herself as the victim of harassment and lies. She pointed at Mark's truck as if it were Exhibit A in her imagined trial. The board listened politely, but gave her no sympathy. In fact, one member reminded her sharply that HOA meetings were not legal courts and that personal lawsuits were not HOA matters. The reminder stung, and Karen's face flushed, but she pressed on, trying to salvage her authority. Mark didn't speak during the meeting. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Neighbors who once stayed neutral now shifted further in his direction, quietly disgusted by Karen's desperation. For the first time, people began whispering about ways to remove Karen from the HOA altogether, even though she wasn't an elected official. The idea of formally banning her from board meetings was floated off. I thought that would have been unthinkable just months ago. But Karen, blinded by obsession, didn't notice the tide turning against her. She saw only one thing: Mark's truck, sitting proudly in his driveway, untouchable. And every day she saw it, she burned with rage. The lawsuit, though her boldest move yet, was just the beginning of her final unraveling. The neighborhood was watching closely. The board was tightening its grip, and Mark was more prepared than ever. Karen believed she still had power. What she didn't realize was that every step she took only made her collapse more certain, and as Mark sat quietly at home, binder now overflowing with evidence, he knew one truth that Karen had yet to face. The war she started wasn't ending in court, it was ending in her complete downfall. But how far would she go before that happened? That was the question weighing heavily over the neighborhood. And the answer, everyone sensed, was coming soon. The lawsuit Karen had launched against Mark sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For weeks, the community had lived in a tense stalemate, waiting to see how the battle would unfold. Some residents shook their heads at Karen's desperation. Others whispered anxiously about legal costs and the precedent it might set, while a few quietly wondered if Mark would finally cave under the pressure. But Mark didn't flinch. He prepared with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every stage of Karen's harassment. His binder, once just a weapon against HOA hypocrisy, had now grown into a full arsenal of defense. Inside it were photographs of vandalism, videos of trespassing, police reports, contractor logs, and signed statements from neighbors. It was overwhelming in its detail, and his lawyer was almost impressed by how meticulously it had been compiled. Karen, on the other hand, strutted around as if victory was already hers. She boasted to neighbors that she would ruin Mark in court, claiming that once she won, his truck would be gone, his reputation destroyed, and his finances drained. But behind her confident mask, cracks were beginning to show. The first crack appeared when her lawyer quietly suggested that her case was weak. He explained in careful legal terms that suing someone for defamation required proof of lies, not truths. Mark's binder wasn't lies, it was evidence. When Karen pushed back, insisting that she was being attacked, the lawyer reminded her that courts didn't deal in feelings, only facts. Karen didn't like that answer. She dismissed his warnings, choosing instead to hear only what she wanted, that a lawsuit was filed and Mark was now on the hook. In her mind, that was enough. But reality has a way of creeping in, no matter how tightly someone clings to delusion. The second crack appeared when the HOA board took notice. Tired of Karen using meetings as her personal stage, they voted to restrict her speaking time and limit discussions to actual neighborhood business. It was the closest thing to an official gag order they could issue, and it humiliated Karen. For years, she had dominated meetings with her endless complaints. And now, in front of her neighbors, her power was being stripped away, piece by piece. Still, she pressed on. Mark, meanwhile, continued living as normally as possible. He worked his job, kept his yard tidy, and drove his old truck proudly, even with the slashed tires replaced. His calmness unnerved Karen more than anger ever could. She wanted him rattled. She wanted him to fight back in the open, to give her something new to twist into an attack. Instead, his composure made her look increasingly unhinged. And then came the third crack, the one that changed everything. While preparing her lawsuit, Karen had to submit documentation of her own finances, property condition, and personal history. Legal processes demand transparency, and that transparency exposed truths Karen had fought hard to keep hidden. It turned out that her shed, the same one Mark had photographed, wasn't just a code violation, it was unpermitted construction. Something that could carry fines far greater than she had anticipated. Worse, records showed that she had been warned about it years ago and had ignored the notice. The discovery spread quietly at first, whispered between board members and a few neighbors who caught wind of it, but soon it became common knowledge. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, had been breaking some of the biggest ones herself, and doing so for years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. At the next HOA meeting, attendance swelled again, and the air was thick with curiosity. People wanted to see how Karen would spin her way out of this, but when the board brought up her violations, backed by official county records, Karen froze. For the first time, she had no ready excuse, no finger to point, no deflection that could save her. Her face flushed, and her voice cracked as she tried. to insist it was all a mistake, that she had never been properly informed. But the board wasn't buying it. They had paperwork, dates, and signatures. The evidence was undeniable. Mark sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But inside, he knew the tide had fully turned. Karen wasn't just fighting him anymore. She was fighting reality itself. The lawsuit she had filed now looked weaker than ever. Her credibility, once the backbone of her authority, was shattered. And yet, even as neighbors whispered and the board issued new fines against her, Karen refused to admit defeat. That refusal would prove to be her undoing, because instead of retreating, she doubled down once again. Within a week, Karen began posting rants online. She created long social media posts accusing Mark of ruining her life, painting herself as the victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. She posted blurry photos of his truck, writing captions about how it was bringing down property values. She even named board members, accusing them of corruption and favoritism. What Karen didn't realize was that by taking her obsession online, she was digging an even deeper hole. Her posts became public record, something that could easily be used against her in court. Screenshots spread quickly, and before long, even residents from nearby neighborhoods were shaking their heads at the infamous HOA Karen. The woman who once commanded fear now inspired ridicule. But ridicule wasn't enough for Karen. In her mind, she had one last card to play, one desperate move that would finally give her the upper hand. She began lurking around Mark's property again. But this time, she wasn't just watching. Neighbors noticed her snapping photos late at night, sometimes even with a flashlight, as if she was searching for some hidden violation she could use against him. Others swore they saw her talking to strangers at the edge of the neighborhood. Men who didn't seem to live there. Mark noticed too. His cameras picked up her shadowy figure more than once, and each time, he added the footage to his ever-growing collection. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. Karen had lost her authority, her credibility, and her reputation. The lawsuit was crumbling, her violations exposed. Her social media rants only made things worse. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She still believed she could win. And as the neighborhood braced itself for her next move, Mark sat quietly in his living room, flipping through his binder of evidence, knowing that whatever Karen tried, she was only digging herself deeper into a pit she could never escape. The question now wasn't whether Karen would fall, what was how far she would drag the neighborhood down with her before she hit the bottom. The neighborhood had grown used to Karen's antics. But by the time her lawsuit began to unravel, it became clear that something had shifted inside her. She was no longer the smug enforcer she once pretended to be. She was frantic now, erratic. Like a gambler who had already lost too much but couldn't resist doubling down on every hand. Mark sensed it. The neighbors sensed it. Even the HOA board, once patient with her interruptions, seemed uneasy whenever she spoke. Her voice carried a wild edge, her words spilling out too quickly, too loudly, as if she was trying to drown out the silence of people no longer taking her seriously. But being ignored only made Karen louder. She stormed into board meetings, demanding special hearings. She shoved flyers into mailboxes, accusing Mark of criminal behavior. She began standing at the entrance of the neighborhood with a handmade sign that read, "Asterisk, this community is under attack by liars." Asterisk, cars passed by slowly. Drivers staring at the woman who had once wielded influence. Now reduced to waving cardboard on the sidewalk, the spectacle embarrassed the neighborhood. Families whispered about moving. Parents worried what new families touring the area might think if they saw Karen screaming at passing cars. What had once been an internal HOA squabble had turned into a circus. And still, her obsession with Mark's truck burned the brightest. Neighbors noticed she had begun circling his house at odd hours again, snapping photos, crouching near his fence, sometimes even muttering angrily to herself. Mark's cameras caught her wandering across his lawn late at night, flashlight in hand, peering into his windows. The footage was chilling. She wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was trespassing in ways that could no longer be ignored. Mark filed another police report. This time, the officers took it more seriously. With a lawsuit pending and a long trail of documented behavior, they warned Karen that criminal charges were on the horizon if she didn't stop. But Karen dismissed it all, laughing bitterly. To her, the police were part of the conspiracy now. And on Mark's plot to destroy her, her desperation was turning dangerous. Then one morning, the neighborhood woke up to something that pushed everything past the point of no return. Mark's truck, the same old pickup that had sparked the entire feud, was found covered in spray paint. Across the hood in angry red letters, someone had scrawled, *eyesore. The paint dripped down the sides, staining the windows, the tires, the bed. It was an act of pure malice, and everyone knew who had done it, even if nobody had seen her in the act. Mark, calm as always, didn't shout. He didn't storm through the neighborhood accusing anyone. He simply photographed everything, uploaded the images to his growing file, and called the police. When the officers arrived, neighbors came out of their houses, shaking their heads. Some whispered to Mark that they had heard Karen outside late the night before. Others admitted they'd seen her carrying spray cans earlier in the week. The police added it all to their report. Karen wasn't arrested that day, but the tension in the air made it clear. Her time was running out. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Attendance was overwhelming. Neighbors packed the room, murmuring, some angry, some frightened. They had tolerated Karen's power trips, her rants, even her lies. But vandalism was too far. Property damage meant real consequences. And the neighborhood, collectively, had had enough. The board announced they would pursue official action to bar Karen from future meetings and strip her of any HOA involvement. They also pledged to support Mark fully if the lawsuit moved forward. Their statement was met with applause, something rare at HOA gatherings. It wasn't just support for Mark, it was a unified stand against Karen. But unity didn't break her. It only pushed her further into the spiral. The next week, Karen escalated her campaign online. She created videos ranting about Mark, waving papers she claimed were proof of corruption. Accusing the board of being a secret cabal, her videos were incoherent. But they spread quickly, shared by people who couldn't believe her level of obsession. She became a local spectacle, her name whispered outside the neighborhood. Her face recognized in grocery stores. Mark, meanwhile, stayed silent. He never responded to her online. He never raised his voice in public. His restraint only made her look worse. Every new rant, every new accusation, every desperate post, each one contrasted sharply with his quiet composure. And then, one night, Karen made her boldest move yet. Mark returned home from work to find a thick envelope shoved into his mailbox. Inside were dozens of printed pages, screenshots of his own social media, photos of him in his yard, even blurred images of his family taken from a distance. At the bottom was a typed note. It's unsigned but unmistakably Karen's. *, the world will know who you really are. *, it wasn't just harassment anymore. It was intimidation. A threat. Mark took the evidence straight to his lawyer. He also handed copies to the police, who began to consider whether Karen's actions qualified as stalking. The situation had escalated far beyond neighborhood politics. It was now a matter of safety. And yet, Karen still believed she had power. At the next HOA meeting, she barged in, carrying a stack of binders, slamming them onto the table as if she were about to deliver the case of the century. Her voice trembled with rage as she accused Mark of weaponizing the law against her, of brainwashing the neighbors, of using his truck as a political statement. Her words spilled out in a torrent of paranoia. And this time nobody even tried to stop her. They just watched. The board let her rant, knowing that every word only sealed her fate. Neighbors whispered, some shaking their heads, some laughing quietly. Karen didn't notice. She was too consumed by the sound of her own voice. Mark sat silently in the back of the room, binder on his lap, waiting. Karen's desperation had reached its peak. She had vandalized property, harassed her neighbors, and turned herself into a public spectacle. Now she was threatening, ranting, spiraling in full view of the community she had once ruled with fear. The board adjourned the meeting without acknowledging her tirade. People filed out, ignoring her as she shouted after them. For Karen, the silence was worse than confrontation. She had become invisible. But as Mark walked home that night, binder tucked under his arm, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. Her lawsuit was collapsing, her credibility destroyed. Her neighbors united against her, and yet people like Karen rarely faded quietly. Something darker was building inside her. Something reckless, the neighborhood could feel it. The calm before a storm had returned. By the time the spray paint had been scrubbed from Mark's truck and the HOA board had stripped Karen of her platform, most neighbors assumed her fight was finally over. They believed she would retreat into silence, embarrassed by her downfall, nursing her bruised pride in private. But those who truly understood Karen knew better. Humiliation didn't end her obsession, it inflamed it. And in the weeks that followed, her behavior grew darker. She stopped waving her clipboard in public. She stopped ranting at HOA meetings. She even stopped handing out flyers. On the surface, it almost looked as though she had given up. But her silence was deceptive, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Neighbors whispered uneasily about seeing her blinds twitch whenever Mark drove by. Others noticed her pacing her backyard at night, muttering under her breath, staring toward Mark's property as though she could burn it down with her eyes alone. The lawsuit, meanwhile, was collapsing. Karen's lawyer quietly filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. It was legal code for something simpler. Karen had become impossible to represent. Left without counsel, she tried to continue on her own, sending rambling letters to the court filled with accusations, half-truths, and conspiracy theories. The judge, unimpressed, issued stern warnings about frivolous filings. Still, she pressed on. Mark, through it all, remained calm. His binder had grown so thick it was nearly bursting, every page a testament to Karen's unraveling. He knew that patience, not anger, was his greatest weapon. But even he could feel the tension tightening, the sense that something more dramatic was coming, and it did. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Families were outside mowing lawns, children were riding bikes, and the air carried the lazy calm of a weekend. Mark was in his garage, wiping down tools. When the sound erupted, Karen's voice. She was standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, screaming. Not speaking, not ranting like she had at meetings, but screaming high-pitched, furious, incoherent. In her hands, she held a stack of papers, which she flung into the air like confetti. Pages scattered in the wind, littering the street, fluttering onto neighbors' lawns. Curiosity pulled people out of their homes. Windows opened, doors cracked. Children froze on their bikes. Everyone turned to watch the woman who had once played enforcer now unravel completely in front of them. Karen's shouts turned into accusations. She pointed at Mark's house, shrieking that he was a criminal, a fraud, a liar. She accused the HOA board of being infiltrated by corruption. She shouted that the police, the city, even the courts were all conspiring against her. And then she crossed a line that stunned even her, its harshest critics. She stormed onto Mark's driveway, with wild eyes. She pounded on the hood of his truck, leaving dents where her fists landed. She screamed that it was illegal, that it didn't belong, that it was ruining everything. Neighbors gasped, some pulling out phones to record, others whispering in disbelief. Mark stepped out of his garage, phone already in hand, calm but firm as he captured every second on video. The police were called immediately, but Karen didn't stop. She yanked open Mark's trash bins, scattering garbage across his lawn. She pulled at his fence, shaking it violently as though she could tear it down with her bare hands. She screamed so loudly that her voice cracked, her words dissolving into raw, animal-like sounds. By the time the police arrived, the scene looked like chaos. Papers littered the street, garbage covered Mark's yard. Karen was still pounding on his truck, her fists bloody from the effort. Officers rushed to restrain her, pulling her back as she thrashed and screamed that she was fighting for justice. The neighborhood stood frozen, watching as the woman who had once pretended to be their protector was dragged into a police car, her shouts echoing long after the doors slammed shut. Children clung to their parents. Adults exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody spoke for a long moment. the weight of what they had just witnessed, pressing heavily on the quiet street. For Mark, it was surreal. Months of harassment, lies, vandalism, and intimidation had led to this public breakdown. His binder of evidence was no longer just a precaution, it was now part of an official criminal case. The police assured him charges would follow: vandalism, trespassing, harassment, perhaps even stalking. And yet, as he stood there on his driveway, garbage scattered around his feet, Mark didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted. Watching Karen scream as she was pulled away wasn't satisfying, it was sad. A reminder of how far obsession can push someone when they refuse to let go. The HOA board moved swiftly after the incident. They called an emergency meeting, not to discuss votes or fines, but to address what the neighborhood had just endured. The room was packed, residents demanding answers, some furious, others frightened. Families who had once kept quiet now spoke up, recalling times Karen had threatened them, stalked them, or intimidated their children. It became clear that Mark hadn't been her only target, he had simply been her favorite. The board voted unanimously to ban Karen from all future meetings, citing safety concerns. They also pledged to work directly with law enforcement to ensure she could no longer harass residents. For the first time, the neighborhood felt united not just against Karen, but for one another. But while the community tried to heal, Karen wasn't finished. From the confines of her home, awaiting her court dates, she began lashing out online with renewed fury. She created anonymous accounts, posting wild accusations about Mark and the HOA, insisting she was the victim of a grand conspiracy. Her posts became more erratic, filled with rambling sentences and strange claims that had no basis in reality. Neighbors, once fearful of her, now laughed at her online rants. Screenshots circulated, and soon Karen wasn't just infamous in the neighborhood, she was a local spectacle across the city. People whispered about the HOA Karen, who had been hauled away screaming, but Karen didn't care about ridicule. In her mind, she was still fighting, still holding on to a battle she couldn't admit she had lost. And with every new outburst, every desperate post, every reckless word, she pulled herself closer to the edge. Mark, binder, now overflowing, knew the end was near, but he also knew something else. Karen wouldn't go quietly. There was still one more storm left in her. One last desperate act before the collapse was complete. And as the neighborhood braced itself, nobody knew how far she was willing to go. But in the end, it wasn't Mark who ruined Karen. It was Karen who ruined herself. Karen's arrest should have been the end. Most people, after being dragged away, screaming in front of their entire neighborhood, would have retreated in shame. They would have stayed quiet, accepted the consequences, and disappeared from public view. But Karen wasn't like most people. Even with charges pending trespassing, vandalism, harassment, she refused to stop. The police had released her on bail, with strict orders to stay away from Mark and to cease contact with the HOA. But Karen viewed those restrictions not as boundaries, but as challenges. She was convinced she was the victim of a massive conspiracy. In her warped mind, she wasn't guilty. She was a hero under attack. The neighborhood, meanwhile, tried to move forward. The HOA began repairing the damage, installing new security cameras around common areas, and even hiring legal counsel to prepare for any further incidents. Neighbors felt safer, but there was still an uneasiness in the air. Everyone knew Karen was still out there, just a few houses away, simmering in silence. Mark carried on as best he could. His old truck remained in the driveway, freshly cleaned, a symbol of quiet resilience. He kept his binder close, still adding to it whenever Karen slipped up online. But deep down, he sensed something was coming. Karen had been humiliated too many times. She had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing left to lose are dangerous. It started small. Anonymous flyers reappeared in mailboxes, poorly printed rants accusing Mark of being a criminal, the HOA of being a cult, and the neighbors of being sheep. Everyone recognized the handwriting. Even if Karen had tried to disguise it, then came the phone calls. Several residents reported receiving late-night messages from blocked numbers, whispers, heavy breathing, sometimes incoherent shouts before the line went dead. Nobody doubted who was behind them, but Karen wasn't content with whispers in the dark. One Friday evening, as the sun set and families gathered in their yards, she made her move. Neighbors later described it as surreal. Karen stormed into the cul-de-sac, carrying a bullhorn, her voice echoing off the houses. She shouted about corruption, about conspiracies, about how Mark had stolen her life. She waved papers in the air, old HOA documents, random printouts from the internet as if they were proof of her twisted theories. The shouting alone would have been bad enough. But then she turned on Mark directly, marching into his driveway. She pointed the bullhorn at his house, screaming for him to come out. She called him a criminal, a fraud, a monster. Her voice cracked with rage, echoing down the street. Lights flicked on in nearby houses, curtains parted, phones came out. The entire neighborhood was watching. Mark didn't emerge. He stayed inside, quietly recording everything from a window. Karen grew more frantic. She dropped the bullhorn, grabbed a rock from the side of the road, and hurled it at Mark's fence. The crash echoed like a gunshot. Children screamed. Parents shouted for them to get inside. The calm suburban street had turned into chaos. By the time the police arrived, Karen was pounding on the hood of Mark's truck again, her fists bloody, her screams hoarse. Officers rushed to restrain her just as they had before, but this time, the scene was even worse. Karen thrashed violently, shouting that she was being silenced, that the neighborhood would pay for betraying her. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, watching as she was wrestled into the back of the squad car. This wasn't a spectacle anymore, it was frightening. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was a danger. The police didn't release her that night. She was taken into custody, held for psychiatric evaluation, and charged with multiple new offenses: destruction of property, disorderly conduct, violation of her bail terms for the neighborhood. It was the breaking point. The HOA called an emergency meeting the following week. Not in the clubhouse, but in a larger venue to accommodate the crowd. Residents were tired, angry, and scared. They shared stories times Karen had threatened them, trespassed on their property, or tried to blackmail them into siding with her. Some admitted they had stayed silent out of fear. Others confessed they had once supported her, believing she was protecting the neighborhood, only to realize she was using them. Mark sat quietly, listening. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the truth now. The board voted unanimously to pursue a restraining order, not just for Mark, but for the entire HOA. Karen would be legally barred from setting foot on any common property, attending meetings, or contacting residents in any form. They also pledged to support the police investigation fully, ensuring Karen faced the maximum consequences. The vote was met with applause, the loudest the HOA had ever heard. For the first time, the neighborhood was united, not in fear, but in relief. Weeks passed. Without Karen's constant presence, the community began to heal. Lawns were mowed without complaint. Families gathered outside without whispers of HOA spies. The tension that had once hung over every meeting slowly dissolved, and yet the memory of Karen lingered. Her rants online continued for a while, but they reached fewer people. Eventually, her accounts were banned, her posts erased, her voice once so loud faded into static. Mark's truck remained where it had always been, sitting in his driveway. A little old, a little worn, but perfectly his. Neighbors no longer saw it as an eyesore. To them, it had become a symbol, a reminder of how one person's obsession had nearly torn the community apart, and how patience, its evidence, and truth had won in the end. Karen's house, once a hub of drama, grew quiet. The blinds stayed closed, the yard unkempt, the driveway empty. Some whispered she had moved away, others that she was still inside, stewing in bitterness. Nobody really knew, and nobody cared to ask for Mark. Life finally returned to normal. He no longer checked his cameras obsessively, though he kept them running just in case. His binder, now overflowing, sat on a shelf in his office. It was a record of the madness, a reminder of how far things had gone, but he rarely opened it anymore, because the war was over in the neighborhood. Scarred but stronger, had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the loudest enforcer is the biggest violator. Sometimes the person screaming about rules is the one breaking them. And sometimes the best revenge isn't anger or retaliation, it's quiet, steady patience. Letting the truth speak for itself, Karen had tried to destroy him. She had vandalized, lied, harassed, and threatened. She had dragged him into court, into the spotlight, to chaos. And as the neighborhood settled into peace once more, the only sound that lingered was the steady hum of life moving on without her.